Laura has already explained this morning some of the differences between covenant and creed. But first I'll mention, before I elaborate, that scriptures in this tree mention covenant several times. The Hebrew scriptures, sometimes known as the Old Testament, have several mentions in the book of Genesis alone. A covenant with Adam in the story of the Garden of Eden. A covenant with Noah at the end of the story of the flood, which is sealed with a rainbow. A covenant with Abraham, who is considered the founder of at least 3 major world religions, although I would argue it's a few more than that. The New Testament is in fact sometimes called the Testament of the New Covenant, which is exemplified in the stories of the life, teachings, and deeds of Jesus of Nazareth. From these stories, a covenant looks something like a pact, an agreement by which mutual expectations and behaviors are laid out. But it becomes more than that. In our Unitarian Universalist tradition, covenant is even more central than many of the other traditions, which are based on creed, or a specific set of beliefs. This doesn't mean that we don't hold any beliefs. In fact, as you're well aware, in this room alone, there's a wide diversity of beliefs, many of which might not always overlap. But perhaps because of this diverse theological approach, our tradition does not call us to adhere to one specific set of beliefs, a creed. Instead, the spirit that binds our tradition together is covenant, not creed. We say we're a non-creedal tradition, or rather, we say we're a covenantal tradition. By pledging to live in community with each other, by a set of mutual agreements on what we expect of each other and of ourselves, and how we seek to be in right relation with each other. Our best known covenant is perhaps the 7 principles, which we covenant to affirm and promote. But in our communities, we make other covenants as we're needed. There is one tidbit about covenant in the scriptural tradition that I'll briefly mention, and we'll talk more about it later this month. In the stories that feature covenant, there's a recurring theme in which folks involved don't always act within the bounds of the covenant. And still, there is an invitation to always come back. As we understand covenant today, it differs from a contract. In a contract, whenever one party breaks it, the other party is released from all obligation. In a covenant, when someone acts outside of it, other parties are still committed to be bound by the agreement. And that includes the invitation to come back into right relation. So, what are these right relations? I'll refer now to a different set of scriptures. In his book, Billions and Billions, astronomer Carl Sagan devotes an entire chapter to discussion on different ethical rules by which to live by. The chapter is called The Rules of the Game. And if you're curious, there's a link to it on our website in the monthly themes page, which you can access here, ufo.org/category/themes. Many of you will be familiar with the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Like the Christmas story, the golden rule appears in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. It recalls wisdom from the Hebrew Scriptures. Forget about the wrong things people do unto you, and do not try to get even. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's in Leviticus. And treat them as you treat your own citizens. Love foreigners as you love yourselves, because you were foreigners one time in Egypt. It recalls the story from Exodus. Other traditions have some ethical pronouncements that echo the sentiment of reciprocity offered by the Golden Rule. And in fact, right here, it quotes a 7th principle. But Carl Sagan likes to point out some of the other rules, variants of similar sources. Because all these rules have similar formulations, they're often given the names of other metals. And because the others might not sound as noble as the Golden Rule, they tend to recall less valuable metals. Among these metal rules is the similarly sounding silver rule, a negative formulation of the golden counterpart. Do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. At first hearing, it sounds deceptively identical, except the Golden Rule promotes active positive action to benefit others as you would like the same, while the silver version seems more focused on preventing reciprocal harm. Similarly, the brass or brazen rule is reciprocal but more reactive. Do unto others as they do unto you. It functions as a response to other actions, and it's the basis of what is more commonly known as tit for tat. This is a fairly standard rule, perhaps one of the more widely practiced, even without realizing it. And that is perhaps because it does not call for the level of self-reflection that the silver and golden rules invite. Those two rules, silver and gold, indeed ask us first how we love ourselves, so that this may guide us towards how we're going to treat others. The brazen rule and its derivative, tit for tat, have some shortcomings. It risks unhealthy cycles. It works all fine and good as long as others are playing along by treating you the way you'd like to be treated, and you treating them in kind. But as soon as someone treats the other differently, a never-ending cycle of retaliation can begin. Perpetual vendetta. We can think of a few situations in the world where that's illustrated quite clearly. And what happens if someone meant to treat you well according to their standard, but the effect on you was the opposite, since the way they'd like to be treated might not line up with the way you'd like to be treated? The reciprocal nature of these rules is broken by the more unscrupulous iron rule. Do unto others as you like, before they do it unto you. Its moral compass seems to be based strictly on immediate self-interest and the capacity to get away with it. And there is also an odd hybrid between the golden and the iron rules. Sagan phrases it as, suck up to those above you and abuse those below. He calls this one the 10 rule. And he describes it as essentially the golden rule for superiors and the iron rule for inferiors. These days, we might easily think of some real-life people who are exemplars of this rule. The more noble of these rules are probably the ones appropriately named after the noble metals. Those that do not easily tarnish, like gold and silver. One of their ennobling attributes is the fact that they call for self-reflection and invite you to value self-love. Even more valuable if this becomes your guide on how you love your neighbor. But even these aren't without their shortcomings. What happens when you don't love yourself and you treat your neighbor accordingly? The golden rule won't do your neighbor much good if they're treated in a way that isn't respectful of the self. Or maybe you do love yourself and are totally game to treat others in the same way that you honor yourself. But maybe it turns out that the way you honor yourself is not the way others would like to be honored. What does it mean when this well-intentioned ethical guideline still fails to treat others with the respect that they need, even if followed to the letter? Well, there is one metal rule that Carl Sagan doesn't mention, but which has gained popularity. It is called the platinum rule, another noble metal. Do unto others as they would like to have done unto them. This one can be seen